Good evening, dear artists and guests. On behalf of Birla Academy of Art and Culture, I welcome you all. Today we have a panel discussion titled Institutional Intervention in Contemporary Culture. Our panelists don't need any special introduction, as they are known to all and well known in their respective fields. However, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sri Chhatrapati Dutta, Principal of Government Art College. Eminent artist and Professor Adip Dutta, art historian and Professor Soumik Nandy Majumdar, and artist and Professor Sohini Dhar. I also welcome Johny ML, art historian and curator, to moderate this session. Now I would formally request Johny ML to conduct the session, and please come over the stage. Thank you.
Respected panelists, Sohini Dhar, Chhatrapati Dutta, Soumik Nandy Majumdar, Adip Dutta, dear friends, today we have an interesting session called Institutional Interventions in Culture. There is something ironic also, because we are sitting in an institution and we are talking about interventions. Generally, we understand institutions as certain kind of a censoring body, that doesn't really allow us to express things. But there are institutions at the same time, they allow us immensely to proliferate our ideas and things like that. Whenever we talk about institutions, I come from this Althusserian idea of ideological state apparatuses. Most of the institutions have this tendency to be ideological state apparatuses, like family, police, hospital, school, religion. All these things are ideological state apparatus. State uses all these particular entities to institutionalize our culture, our life, and anything related to it. So basically, an institution does classification and ordering of things. So institution, any institution, including family, that comes into place or that comes to act as an ordering agency that classifies and order. So institutions are always not really helping us to proliferate our culture or our ideas, but they help us to live in a society with a certain amount of order. They classify us. They tell us what exactly we need to be. So in the case of culture, institutional intervention is a problematic term. Now coming to culture, what exactly is the meaning of culture? The word culture comes from a root word, Latin word called cultura. So, this word was actually used for rearing up anything, to bring up anything. It didn't have the meaning that we talk about culture today, or we identify as culture today. And by 16th century, it got the parlance as bringing up or rearing up animals, that means cattle, and agriculture, farming. So basically culture was something that had something to do with agriculture, farming, and animal breeding. It didn't have anything to do with the human, connotation or human agency or human life. The word culture got this human implication by 18th century. the post-industrial society started having this idea of culture. Culture means that the human development, human progress. And by 19th century, we come to know that culture, as we understand today, culture is a conglomeration or a combination of ideas which have something to do with our mind, our mental development. A set of rules and principles that help us to grow in a particular society. So these are the two things that actually bring the human life possible in our society. Then there is something very interesting thing happened today is that most of the cultural formations in our life start with schooling or from family. But families are not ideologically free today. Our cultural outlook is actually formed within these families. And when we go to school, there also we are taught in a certain way to behave. Generally we speak that colleges, especially schools and colleges, are ideologically free entities. They are neutral agencies, neutral interfaces where students could be taught. Schools are the places where students learn and teachers taught. That is the way we ideally understand a place called a school. But in fact, the schools are not ideologically free. The teachers come with sort of baggage, and also students come with a sort of baggage, historical and cultural baggage. So it is the teaching is not one-sided. It is actually an interaction. There is always a fight between the ideology of the teacher and the ideology of the students who actually gain their culture from the families. So there is a sense of ordering, there is a forceful ordering of senses or principles within the school. So enculturing of students or enculturing of minds is a totally different issue or a totally different thing which we call enculturation of minds. So these are institutions that make our mind culturally inclined. But those cultures or that cultural teaching need not be necessarily taking us to certain progressive life or something like that. You just imagine a school where we call the school as a neutral space, where the teacher asks the student, what is your caste? Or what your father is doing? Which area you are living in a city? What is your family tradition or a family business? So through all these things, somebody's identity is understood. So how can we call school as a place which is ideologically neutral? So all the institutions in that matter, all the institutions have certain kind of interventions in our mind. And now I would say today, all the cultural institutions or institutions in general enforce some kind of a censorship in our mind. We behave because we are institutionalized, we behave in a certain way, in a certain fashion, fearing that our behavior, our words, our deeds could create some problem for us. So we start self-censoring ourselves. So in this context, in this background, against this backdrop, how we are going to see institutions, even if they are National Gallery of Modern Art, Lalit Kala Academy, or any other art college, any other fine arts museum or gallery, anything, any institution, even the film certification board, like a censor board, any institution, how they are intervening in the cultural makeup of our country or our cultural makeup of our minds. So this is the general backdrop that I would like to actually present as the preamble for this panel discussion, and our format is going to be something like this. Each speaker would take 5 to 6 minutes to present the case, and two of the panelists, like Mr. Chhatrapati Dutta and Soumik Nandy Majumdar, both of them have got a small illustration. That means like, it is going to be a visually illustrated lecture. So that may take a bit more time, like maybe 10 minutes each. So once all these cases are presented, then we will have a kind of open discussion. That is the format of this panel discussion. And with the eminent panelist's permission, I would request Sohini Dhar to come and present your case. Thank you.
Thank you, Johny. Thank you, Shikhadi, and all the members of Birla Academy who has invited me to, present my views on today's talk. And it's a very interesting subject, as we just came to know from Johny. As institutions, as we are all aware of that, and he just talked about it, that institutions in various forms plays a major role in each and every life of ours. I would like to start with the school itself, because I believe in the theory of catch them young, because that is when a child starts to, develop the very basics of human understanding. So keeping that in mind and being a practicing painter, I always feel that at present, what we understand by culture and tradition, which obviously is a very organic growth, it has its own growth. It is never static, it is never, though we say tradition is something age-old, but still it has its own growth. But what I always feel, and presently living in a city like Kolkata, we are perhaps exposed to too much of visual images, which is creating a lot of confusion, and ultimately it is becoming more of an, an aesthetic curfew perhaps, lacking the very understanding of a kind of artistic expression. A simple example can be given that though we have such beautiful art galleries all around the country, and especially in this city, but it is mostly the known faces. Every time we encounter the known faces who all come to see and appreciate the work of art. But from the school days, very presently, even the drawing classes have been eliminated, and as we all are aware of, that is the work education classes which are on. Now from the school days, unless and until a child is given the appropriate, space as well as the appropriate kind of understanding of art, art does not only mean that it has to be a painting or a sculpture, but anything that they can create on their own. I feel this imbalance in the society will keep on going, and there won't be any solution to it. So I feel that to get this, we need to incorporate a kind of policy that way, because institutions are policy makers also at the same time, whether it be an art college or a school or any institution. So we need to make certain kinds of policies which will help the child to imagine, and imagination only can lead the particular person to nurture their originality further in their life. They might not be an artist, they might not be a painter or a sculptor, but as an engineer, as a doctor, that imagination is so very necessary, but that is what is lacking in today's schools. And further, that gets reflected when we don't find any of the common people in general to visit the museums or the interesting exhibitions. I think I just started, and I can leave my other panelists to speak on it. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I don't have any illustrations right now, and I have my panelists who will be showing them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sohini. Now I would request Adip. Yeah, why I'm saying that? Because followed by two visual presentations, so it will be kind of, it will remain in the minds of the audience, and then we can come for the discussion. Please.
Thank you, Johny, for inviting me to reflect on the subject, and thank you, Birla Academy of Art and Culture. It is definitely a privilege to be a part of this panel discussion. To start with, I shall take two different, maybe at times, contradictory positions. One, that of an institution, because I'm part of an institution. I teach at an institution. I shall also be, sort of reflecting on things as an individual practitioner, and especially as, an artist. To be brief, what I understand that there are two kinds of spaces. One that is real, quote unquote real, and the other that is manufactured. And both would have elements of an institution. What I mean by a real space is, a space that would connect to, the socio-cultural, the socio-historical, and the socio-economic situations of the site that it is located at. I'll come up with examples. And then there are spaces which are, again, quote-unquote, elitist spaces. The first space that I'm talking of is a space that I sort of belong to, because the university, is where we get to see students. They come from diverse sort of backgrounds, and they are related to these sort of very specific, real situations. They are human agents that we deal with. And I'll tell you how it sort of, how organically the institution works. At times when you sort of say, when you by chance, when you meet, say, the parents or someone from the family of the students that who've spent, say, 5 to 7 years at the institution, at times it is a moment in itself, because that is when you start thinking that what that particular student has passed through, what has his journey been, because his entire body language, his mind, his sensibility is changed in course of that 5 or 7 years. And when you meet someone from the family, you understand from where he sort of started. So what I understand, that the institution, not consciously, but in an organic fashion, operates silently and sort of transforms an individual. That is what is the best part, the productive part of an institution. So again, sort of to come to the productive part of it, there are institutions which are accommodating and at the same time which are productive. There are institutions which are accommodating but not productive. I'll give you another example. Again, sort of not in any derogatory sense, but in our city there are spaces, public spaces, which used to be of a lot of significance, say in the 60s. Say for instance the Academy of Fine Arts, which is a very important, significant public space, which is not, again, so to speak, an elitist space, which does not have a target audience. But, decide it for yourself what happens when you get to see an exhibition, say, in a commercial gallery. And what happens when there's an exhibition at the Academy of Fine Arts? There's wonderful footfall, and the audiences who are not directly related to art. So, the possibility of a cultural seepage is the most at an institution like the Academy of Fine Arts. But again, unfortunately, over a period of time, that significance has been sort of reduced. There are reasons, of course. They are very strong. So what, sort of to be on track, what I understand that an institution, or if I come down from an institution to a space could just not be accommodating, it also has to be productive. To me, the university, the educational institution is one such space, because again, it sort of deals with the real situations. I'll talk of spaces which are elitist and which are not, so accommodating. For instance, I know, of a neighboring country from where students and artists, they come. So we know of the situation of that country. We know of the situation of their artistic orientations, etc. Now, strangely enough, you get to see these art summits. I beg your pardon for saying so. I'm part of those art fairs, those summits, those whatever, and I will be. And it's sort of, that adds a credibility to my practice in certain contexts. But yet, when I detach myself and I look at these sort of spaces which have become institutions, it's very interesting in the sense, these art summits, these art fairs, these whatever, like, Art Basel, Frieze, and all, they all look alike. And the situation is it's very international, of course. It's sort of a wonderful exposure. You get to see these curators, museum directors, they're coming, they're taking part. But surprisingly enough, local participation, of that country is very is almost negligible. But that's sad, and that's also sort of quite funny at times, because you know of a country, you know of a city in a certain way, and then suddenly when you see these art summits and all that, it's a completely different space altogether. So what I'm basically trying to say is that an institution, it's again an ideal situation, an institution should try to strike, or I shouldn't say should try, but would be in a sort of a productive situation if it strike a balance between, or it knows to strike a balance between the real and the productive. I know that these, the term real, the term productive would require sort of clarifications, but I think as the discussion goes, we can, take it up and we'll sort of discuss it. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adip. And Sohini talked about the policy making in order to start the art education from schools itself. And Adip actually very realistically put two situations, like the real and elitist situation. I think the audience must be lapping up the latter part, because the art expos have become more or less elitist, like exclusive and insular. So that you wonderfully put. Now we have, I would request Soumik to start the visual presentation.
I would like to thank, first of all, Johny and Birla Academy and all of you in the audience for making this evening and this panel discussion happen. In a very meaningful way it has begun. And I would also like to thank all the panelists for being with us today. Now, as a takeoff from what Sohini presented in the beginning, I would like to say that we do need a more liberal approach and policy also towards at a very basic level of art education, particularly at the primary school level. But at the same time, talking about interventions, we do see that how children at various stages, willingly or unwillingly, knowingly or unknowingly, they also kind of make some counter interventions through their artworks, through their creative engagements. But here I do agree with Sohini that but we need to provide that opportunity. We need to provide certain basic kind of spaces in order to ensure that children do make some counter interventions. Otherwise it doesn't happen, and many of us, I know not everybody is fortunate to have studied in such schools. There are schools in India today, plenty of them, where in the name of art education, what is actually done in the classrooms we all know about. We know that it is still in a very pathetic situation. Now, just as a brief preamble to my presentation, I would like to say that what I would like to make you run through today, through these slides, is a kind of I have quite a few slides, so I'm sorry that we won't have enough time to look at each and every slide very carefully. I will run through the images just to give an idea that there is at the next level, that is at the college level, there is always this possibility that instead of entirely depending on the course structure and the curriculum and depending on the institutional approach, again, it is possible that to create spaces, and as Adip rightly said, in fact, we need to manufacture spaces where students can once again intervene back and create further opportunities, further spaces to go beyond what Johny calls or has kind of mentioned briefly or tried to kind of refer to as a kind of censorship that keeps censorship not always in a very categorical manner, but there are all these unwritten ways of telling the students this is something that is expected from you, this is something that is not expected from you, things of this kind. Now, in this context, Kala Bhavan, the institution where many of us here have studied and I'm teaching over there. Now, Kala Bhavan is a very curious case because Kala Bhavan, I'm not going into the history as such today because we don't have really time, but but Kala Bhavan is one such historically extremely important and very significant institution where the very origin of Kala Bhavan is rooted in a kind of historical intervention. And we all know that history, so I'm not going into that history, but what I'm trying to say that right from its beginning, from its inception, the teachers in the Kala Bhavan, the masters in the Kala Bhavan, the students in the Kala Bhavan, they tried to create various kinds of possible interventions within the given space, within the physical space also, and also to manufacture, once again to use Adip's term, to create also public spaces in terms of mural activities, in terms of outdoor sculptures, and also in terms of experimentations, in terms of bridging the gap between what is called art and what is called craft, in terms of addressing this binary very severely, to the extent that Nandalal, even in those days, very early days, had to fight against certain people to convince them that we need to incorporate something like book binding as a part of our curriculum. I mean, this should also be identified as a very interesting one such example of very serious interventions happening, not necessarily in a very theoretical manner, but in a very practical way. Now, you see, in this photograph we see that even in Kalabhavan, at least in some of the classes, particularly in this photograph, we see Ram Kinkar is conducting a class on model study, and then he or some other teacher, I don't know, in the next photograph we see Ram Kinkar's own sculpture becomes a model. I mean, this has never happened before, because what we know from the history of the art colleges established by the colonial government, for example, government art school and all, the only model, sculptural model that you were supposed to study was the Greco-Roman models, the Western realistic models. Not such an example of a very modernist sculpture where that becomes a model to study. Anyway, now this is where things become very interesting, that not only through art and design and mural and outdoor sculpture, even using architecture as a form of intervention. Something like this, very famously known as the Black House, a very unique hostel with a lot of relief sculpture. And interestingly, on the walls of the Black House, in the relief sculptures, you find images. None of which is actually a creative image, in that sense that none of them is an image which was created by or imagined by the artist, because all these images were sourced from art history. So the entire building was wrapped up with art historical images. This is also a very interesting intervention into the whole notion of the creation by artists, because we are always looking at, or we are demanding something that is original, something that is unique, something that we have never seen before. And all these people here, Ram Kinkar mainly and his students, even Nandalal took part briefly in this project, they rather source their images from history instead of creating new images. Now, we will have very quickly, after a few slides, another image where we will see this very Black House is being intervened once again in a workshop which happened very recently, just a couple of years back. Now, so even space where art teaching would take place, inside the classroom, outside the classroom, all these things were happening in a very spontaneous way, I would say, in the Kalabhavan history, and particularly getting some murals done on the various walls of the buildings on the Kalabhavan campus assumed a form of a movement, to the extent that one author called it the mural movement in Shantiniketan. Now, having said this, I would also like to say that intervention is, as far as the history of Kalabhavan is concerned, is not just a matter of a moment, not just a matter of a historical moment. It eventually became a matter of a process. I mean, it became an ongoing process, to the extent that one on the top left you see one of the oldest buildings in Kalabhavan, designed by the famous architect Shuren Kaur. And this is how it was conceived, and this is how it was, until in the middle picture you see, just on the occasion of Nandan Mela some 7-8 years back, and one of our teachers and a group of students thought that let us copy and in an enlarged way some images from Shohojpat illustrated by Nandalal on this building, also as a tribute to Nandalal Bose, because it is in this building where Nandalal Bose had his studio. And finally, few years back, the same building got a tiled mural work done by K.G. Subramanian, and intervention came to a kind of full circle, because you can't intervene into this building anymore. So it's very interesting that for me it is a very symbolic kind of story, symbolic narrative, because on the one hand we do see that to a certain point, I mean, if you look at the history of Kalabhavan chronologically, up to a certain point this intervention was a process. It got ingrained into the life of Kalabhavan artists, students and teachers. But then it came to a halt, where interventions almost turned into a kind of baggage which we term as heritage. And this is where I think I would like to refer you back to Johny's preamble, the way he wonderfully presented the case, that then once it becomes a baggage and it tends to become stagnant, then it's very difficult then to expect the institution again regain its drive to intervene. And then we tend to say that a place like Kalabhavan has become stagnant, it has become a dead place, a moribund place, and it can't create any intervention anymore. And I do not subscribe to this view, because this view tends to consider only what the institution, as organization, as a kind of, an ideological state apparatus, as you had called, is supposed to do. I would rather like to now look at how the students are responding to this. Are they simply following this stagnant position, or they are also trying to create certain interventions? And this is where the case becomes again very interesting. So I move away from the heritage and look at the contemporary activities coming up from the students, how students are responding. Now, just before I move on to the next few slides, let me say that two things have been identified in this history of Kalabhavan so far. One, there are artworks which are permanent, and at the same time, the notion of something that is not permanent, something that is ephemeral, was also very much a part of that practice. For example, you can't believe that this is a practice wall where murals are done every year by a group of students, and very next year the entire mural is removed. And nobody complains. Everybody is happy with that. It is because we know that permanence and impermanence, something that is there forever and something that is ephemeral, the coexistence of these two aspects make our engagements more meaningful in various ways. So I'm not going into the details of these images, but as it is well known, and as it is also the case with most of the art colleges across the country, that now students have learned and they also feel free to engage themselves with various kinds of materials beyond what is taught in the classroom. So this material liberation has created an enormous opportunity for the students to explore into various ideas and concepts as well. Now, why Kalabhavan is a curious case, and as I just mentioned, that what started off as an intervention, not only within the art world but also in the contemporary culture of those days, it certainly became a kind of cultural baggage. Then there are certain practices which are still being carried on. For example, the alpuna. the Alpona practice in Kalabhavan done on various occasions, and many of them are repetitive. Only on certain occasions we do find some reinvention, some reimaginations and reinterpretations. But then, when a student tries to do an Alpona, a kind of floor drawing on the Kalabhavan campus, and it is not a traditional Alpona that he is trying to do. Unfortunately, I don't have any image of the finished work. But what he finally did, he did very brief kind of diagram, circular diagram on this platform known as Chatal in Kalabhavan campus, and then he performed right standing on the Alpona. And he performed a small little piece, not very prescripted, pretty spontaneous, on the idea of cross-gender. So he's taking this opportunity and this practice of Alpona floor drawing, this floor graphics to a very interesting level. And nobody had asked him to do. For example, in the next slide you see the same chatal, that same platform. One fine morning we see is entirely covered with a very shiny synthetic, blue colored synthetic material. And when that group of students were asked, what exactly was your reading? They just told that we want to capture the sky on this dry chatal. That's what they said. Again, this is not a part of their daily work. This is not part of their curriculum. They come up with these things without any kind of pre-informations, and these are like surprises that keep happening in the campus. Again, on the same chatal, you see how one given space gets reinterpreted. Somebody, a student, creates a maze and he begins to walk on it and he does a performance right on that space. I'm not going into the details of these programs. I'm just trying to give you an idea that how the space gets reinterpreted and reimagined, mainly from the students' participations. And this is a part of a project of which Chhatrapati was also a part. He was also a resource person over there. And the entire project was around Black House, reinterpreting the heritage and creating different sorts of interventions. Yes, almost I'm coming to an end. Quickly, we run through a few slides. Just to give an idea, and heritage can be reinterpreted instead of leaving it at a stagnant moment. And since Chhatrapati was part of this project, he could actually explain where there were also performances on the ground plan of this. Then Nandan Mela is another occasion where students go gaga over free kind of creations, but mostly in a decorative manner. But yet, these are like spaces, opportunities or moments where you can intervene the space, reinterpret the space, even decorate the space at a very basic level and transform the space, maybe for 2 days. Similar things right now are happening in view of Chhatrapati. People have already geared up for that. So various kinds of things keep happening, to the extent that one student, he got so fed up after working 7 days and nights, he just left his materials on the Kalabhavan campus and identified that as his installation. Like this. Like this. I'm not going into the details of this, or I'm not going to describe these things, but just last 3 words I would like to say and wind up my presentation. One of the buildings, interestingly, it was a heritage building. This is the building where Somnath Kaur had stayed for a long time, then Shushenda had stayed. Now it became, it was in a pathetic, it was almost kind of ruined and dilapidated. So the authority thought that let us demolish the building and create a new building in place of that. And when a student who was working in that studio came to know, he started doing some graffiti images rapidly, just before it was demolished. And knowing very well that these paintings are not going to be there even for more than a day. Then there was this student who started doing some drawings on a a pile of bricks. And the bricks, and he did not very casually, he did quite carefully, and knowing very well that the bricks would be taken away one by one, and his drawings are going to disappear, simply vanish. Now, one of the last projects done by a student last year was this, that when he came to know that the plastering is going to be removed from this graphics building, he started painting it. And the masons came and they removed the plasters, and with those pieces he created an image of Buddha right at the middle of the campus. And when even this Buddha began to look emaciated because those pieces started coming off, then he kind of gathered those pieces on that same chakal again, and just by placing this notice, don't touch, kind of makes a mockery of this whole notion of what is art. And this is where I would like to, I'm sorry that I had to end it very quickly, but again we will have time to discuss and expand on the issues I just briefly mentioned. Thank you, Johny.
Soumik, thank you very much. It was really a wonderful, enlightening, illustrated lecture.